The wind began as a hush across a land of stone and snow, a breath tracing over towers of gray and the branches of trees that stare into winter. In that hush a promise was made, the kind that binds one life to many, and a child wailed at the edge of the world. He came to a keep whose bones were older than the songs, brought in the arms of a man who did not speak of the road he had taken. The walls accepted them without question, like a forest takes in fallen leaves. The child grew with the cadence of distant wolves and the steely ring of practice yards, knowing warmth by the blaze of a great hearth and coolness in a glance that did not quite soften. He learned early that a name can be a doorway that never opens, and so he made his own door in quiet ways, through steadiness and grit and the stubborn grace of a boy who refuses to yield to the cold. He watched the banners of his home shift and ripple in the wind, watched brothers and sisters tumble through the courtyards, watched the snow thicken in drifts along the ramparts until the world felt carved from frost. In the practice yard, he found his breath in the rhythm of wood and dull steel, found the way a body learns to measure distance and trust its own balance. He respected the weight of a blade and the greater weight of when to keep it sheathed. He was sharp-eyed and spare of word, quick to act and quicker to take blame, and he smiled when he did, as though it were something precious he carefully rationed. When the day came that they found the wolf pups tangled in root and bone, he chose the one as pale as winter itself, a creature silent as starlight whose red eyes held the memory of ancient snows. The boy named him without speaking, and the name was simply the way they looked at each other and understood. He learned to listen to things most forgot how to hear. The creak of a wall settling after sundown, the moan of wind through cold arrow slits, the rhythm of his own steps echoing alongside ghosts, a faint second shadow that never left him. He loved his home with a pain that could not be soothed, the way one loves a place that shows your reflection but never your full face. He understood that love is not always a feast. Sometimes it is a plain, steady bread eaten alone in a corner, and every bite makes you stronger. He learned to measure his life against the rhythm of seasons, long autumns that dragged their cloak along the ground, winters that did not ask permission when they entered. When the world called him to the wall, it felt less like a choice than a current he stepped into, a road that flowed northward as surely as rivers follow the pull of the moon. He rode with an uncle who spoke of old vows and a man with clever eyes who drank laughter like wine, and he looked up for the first time at a barrier that made the sky feel lower. The wall was not merely ice. It was time frozen into a cliff, a blue cathedral that swallowed the horizon. He touched its surface and felt the ache of thousands of hands before him and the echo of their promise, a litany that asked a life and gave only watchfulness in return. The cold bit his lungs until they learned to bear it, and the nights pulled tight over his head until they learned to breathe within them. He stood in formation, he learned where to stand and when to bow his head. He learned the names of men who were not born to command and would be asked to do so anyway. He marched, he sharpened. He ate food that tasted of iron and smoke, and found a friend whose fear had hardened into kindness. He saw then that courage and tenderness are cousins. One holds the shield, the other mends the hand that carries it. He learned the oaths by heart, not as a chain but as a path lit by small fires. He watched the dark beyond the wall wake, a restless continent of forest and mountain and frost-laden wind, and from that dark wandered stories with wet footprints and broken voices. He saw how quickly a campfire becomes a beacon for things that do not love its glow. He rode to halls where roof beams were blackened with old smoke and where the cost of survival could be reckoned in suns. He watched a crow settle on a bent branch and thought of old eyes that had seen more winters than any king. In those days, a raven sometimes flapped down with a message that smelled of wax and desperation. There was talk of dead men who would not lie still, of tracks that froze into the ground as if the earth tried to hold them back and failed. On the edge of that northern wild, he learned to follow silence as if it were a trail. He climbed with a band of men who understood that a single misstep could be an epitaph. When he saw her in the snow, hair like wild copper catching the light even when the sun hid itself, he realized that the wild was not merely a place but a way of being, and he was young enough to think both could be tamed by arms and lips. She laughed at maps and at the names carved into stones by dead hands. She laughed with warmth that made him doubt the wall's height. For a time he straddled two ways of living, one made of rules and watched gates, one made of firelit nights under ungoverned stars, and his heart learned that a line drawn in ice can still melt. Mountain wind taught him how desire sounds when it sighs through a pass, and grief taught him how quiet love becomes when arrows whisper. There are moments a life balances on, edges so thin you only see them later. When he turned back toward the wall, it was not from lack of love, but because the wind carried a warning he could not ignore. He returned with the smell of pine smoke and sorrow clinging to him, and the men in black listened to his counsel not because they adored him but because they understood necessity. The first great night of battle at the wall tasted of pitch and iron and furnace heat, a roar under the stars, wild horns and answering shouts, ropes and ladders slick under frozen hands. He fought the way his teachers taught him, and his heart commanded him. Steady, present, unafraid to step into the space where another would have stood. Dawn revealed victory that did not look like triumph. Broken timber, blood-soaked snow, the heaviness of bodies that had names only yesterday. Leadership finds the quiet ones sooner than it finds the loud. He was called to decide, and in deciding found himself altered. In him, mercy and sternness contended like two stags who knew they shared a valley. He opened the gate to those who had once tried to kill him, because the danger pressing in from farther north cared nothing for old quarrels. He spoke words to men who detested him because he asked them to change. He bore their anger like sleet, painful, ordinary, unceasing. He insisted on a future that could not exist if the past kept all its debts. In the gray halls where ravens waited, he met a king with a face like a storm and a priestess who watched flames as though they had voices. Their arrival was fire in a monastery, rattling all the iron. He learned that victory at the wall had only been a reprieve and that the dead were mustering a world away from mercy. He sailed to a broken harbor on a cold sea and found there a village clinging to life as the tide clings to rock. He watched mothers argue with fate at the edge of boats, watched warriors lower their weapons when the children cried, watched the sky turn the color of ashes. Then the storm came, no rain, only a blizzard of ruin poured from a cliff of ice made flesh, a cavalry of silence whose spears were frost and whose eyes were winter. He fought, and every swing was like pushing through water that had turned to glass. When the sea finally lay between him and that shore, the dead crowded the pier as if they had never feared drowning. He saw a figure lift its arms and call souls to attention as easily as a captain counts his men. He understood that the wall was marrow deep in him for a reason, and that reason had never been to judge the living but to bar the dead. Not all debts are owed to enemies. In the halls of his own order, he met the kind of reckoning that keeps its voice low while drawing the blade. Knives found him under stars that had watched him take his oath, and he fell into a snowbank that did not hold him like home but like earth. There are thresholds no man crosses alone, and even the gods may use unlikely hands. The fire priestess called to her power and to whatever wild mercy listens in the cracks between worlds, and breath returned to him like a tide breaking ice. He rose, trembling, to find that dying had not taken his purpose. It had burnished it. He gave justice to those who had mistaken his resolve for tyranny, and he stepped outside gates that fluttered behind him like exhausted wings. The vows that had bound his youth loosened their knots. He did not tear them. He simply walked on. Sorrow met him on the road and held out a hand in the form of a sister he thought he had lost to darkness. Their embrace was not dramatic. It felt like a room he had left and returned to find unchanged, a childhood rescued by touch. With her, he reclaimed a hall that had been stolen, carrying banners as if they were lanterns for the dead to see their way home. He stood on a winter field opposite a man whose cruelty had been sharpened on living bones. Snow flurried through the air, and then smoke, and then dirt when horses leaped into a storm of arrows. He knew the panic of a crowd that folds upon itself, the blindness of men pressed so tight that breath becomes a memory. He felt the ground swallow his boots and spit him out again, and he rose into light and saw riders pour over a ridge like a second dawn. The battle ended with the quiet that follows a scream, and he walked into a hall he had first known as a boy, the stones unchanged though his hands felt older than the mountains. In the noble solitude of winter there are moments made for joy, and they came like sparrows to a new-built wall. People knelt and named him their guardian, their king, their winterkeeper. He did not swell with it but bowed as though he wore the weight of other men's promises. That title did not keep him from leaving. He went to an island carved of black rock and ancestral pride, walking into a hall where dragons made the air smell of storms even when they slept. There he met a young woman whose every choice had been wedded to destiny, a ruler born in blood and tempered by loss, and between them lay arrogance and attraction like two stones in a stream. He spoke of a danger without a crown. She spoke of crowns without a future, and slowly they found the bridge that could carry both their truths. He walked into caverns where old bones of the world held chalk drawings that told stories in a language as plain as a lullaby. The living had once stood together against night. He climbed onto a creature older than any kingdom and learned the sensation of sky as a living thing. He rode north again and again because north was where the story turned its face. On one of those journeys, he led a handful of stubborn hearts across a frozen world to snatch a proof of death from the dead themselves. The blizzard closed on them like a fist, and for a long, breaking day, hope narrowed to the warmth of shared breath and the fragile islands of ice on which they stood. A queen on dragonback came to pull them from the jaws of winter, and the cost of that rescue burned hot and awful and then fell silent as a shattered star sinking into a lake. He returned with that loss folded into him like a secret. Love grew where respect had taken root, and the world tilted. The truth of his blood drifted toward him like a snowflake you only see when it lands on your glove. Delicate, cold, undeniable. His life, it turned out, had been threaded with a name that belonged to fire and ancient crowns, and yet the knowledge did not rearrange his heart. He was still himself, scarred by duty, loyal to the living. He spent a long night in a keep that had chid the birth of spring many times and feared this might be the last. The flames guttered and thundered and fell to embers. The dead came like a tide with no moon to command it, and the living answered with all the blaze left in a world taught to be cold. He fought not only with steel but with the steadiness that keeps an army from breaking, and when dawn crept through the clouds it found him stunned by relief and numbed by the number of candles to be lit. He walked among the bodies and touched a shoulder here, a cheek there, as if these gestures could root him in a morning that otherwise threatened to float away. Peace did not follow victory. The queen with dragons was less a beacon now and more a storm narrowing into a funnel. Advice turned to argument, argument to whispers that left a taste of smoke on the tongue. He watched a friend commit treason by caring too much and another justify cruelty by drawing a straight line to a better world. He entered a city he had never wanted to conquer and heard the skies tear like cloth. Fire fell, the streets became a kiln, and the people running within them became shadows moving inside an orange dream. He moved through those streets in a daze that tasted of ash, calling out under a sky that did not listen. When the bell of surrender rang, it felt like a prayer, not to a god but to a human decision, and even prayers can be ignored. He found her in a throne room that had been empty as a promise for seasons upon seasons. Snow or ash drifted through torn ceilings. He could not tell which, and the iron chair that had driven so many mad waited like a relic from a religion nobody now believed. Her eyes shone not with malice but with certainty. She spoke of a new world, and he felt the walls of his ribcage grow tight, as if his heart had been asked to beat without rhythm. Love, at its deepest, is honesty regardless of cost. He drew her into an embrace that was both farewell and blessing, and when he stepped back he had done what the world required and murdered what remained of his own softest self. A beast roared grief in a voice that shook the history of rooms and melted the throne into a river of iron tears, and then the creature lifted her and vanished into cloud. He did not run after them. He had nowhere to go that would not put him once more at the center of a circle that had hurt enough. Judgment followed not because it was just but because a balance had to be struck and no one could agree on numbers. He was caged gently, fed softly, and delivered a future he had once chosen and then abandoned. The watch again, a dark garment and a long road and a horizon marked by frost. He returned to the wall with a face like a map of all the distances he had crossed. He stood in the yard where he had bled as a boy and listened to the ravens as if they were old teachers repeating a lesson for the very last time. He embraced a sister who wore power like a winter mantle and a brother whose eyes saw a river of time too wide to ford. He knelt to a wolf that had followed him through dreams, pressing his forehead to its fur until the thunder in his head eased. He smiled at a friend who had become more legend than man and discovered that legends still laugh at the same jokes. When the gate rolled open for him, Wood groaning as if remembering all the lives it had permitted and denied, the world it revealed was not only cold. It held color guarded by the season, the red wink of berries, the brown strength of bark, the blue of shadow pooling behind drifts. The free people waited, their eyes honest as winter water, their leader grinning as if the story had ended exactly as it was always meant to. The wolf trotted forward, looked back once to make sure, and then slipped between trunks printed with old scars. He followed, carrying no banner but the breath steaming from his lips, no burden but the memory of those he had led and loved and lost. The snow muffled the world until the sound of a step became a private thing, a confession from boot to earth. He walked and the air filled his lungs like forgiveness. He slept under skies so clear the stars looked like ice chips scattered by a careful hand, and he woke to a silence that did not scold. He helped raise palisades of peeled logs and taught children to string bows without bruising their arms. He judged the age of tracks, the weight of a storm, the honesty of a promise. He remembered every face he had failed and honored them by building things that would survive a hard season. He had lived, for so long, in rooms full of echoing names. Now he learned the comfort of rooms with none. When he lifted his eyes to the horizon, he did not see a border. He saw a road with many little forks, each leading to some small kindness that needed doing. Sometimes he dreamed of a tower and a promise sealed in blood, and the dream no longer had thorns. Sometimes, when the wind blew from the south carrying the waxy scent of parchment and politics, he looked toward a wall that had stopped more than ice and thought of a boy with raw hands and a heavy heart. He would smile at that boy and forgive him for everything he did not know. Sometimes he thought of a throne melted into a puddle and felt no joy, only the steady certainty that metal forged for domination is always a poor metal for making homes. He remembered a queen's fierce gaze and a wildling's laugh, a father's grave kindness and a mother's absence shaped like a doorway nobody goes through anymore. He remembered the feel of a dragon's back beneath him, immense, alive, indifferent to crowns, and he remembered that nothing he loved had ever been his to keep. Years in the true north are counted differently. They are the length of a walk to water and back, the time it takes a child to outgrow the boots you made, the number of beads a woman strings while talking about her dead. He saw the thaw come slowly, watched streams cut loose, listened to a world that had learned resilience as a second lawn. Gauge. He carved notches on a staff to mark days until the wood ran out of room and he had to begin again. He wore his hair longer, let his beard become another winter garment, and kept his blade not as an emblem but as a tool that required thought before use. Ghost grew gray at the muzzle and slept closer to the fire when the wind wailed. Tormund cursed the cold cheerfully and told stories that stretched until truth snapped and then laughed at the break. He did not stop being who he had been. When a threat rose, he stood facing it. When a quarrel swelled into the kind of bitterness that stains a community, he cut it smaller with fairness. When someone was lost in a storm, he went after them, and if he could not bring them back, he brought back their name. In dreams, he still heard the call of horns, but upon waking, he reached for kindling. His body learned the ache of work that heals rather than wounds. Children ran to him not because he was a king or a commander, but because he knew how to fix a brace so a door would not bang in the night. He spoke rarely of the South, and when asked whether kings and queens are worth all the trouble they cause, he would glance toward the forest and say that trees make better emperors. Once, in a spring so tentative the buds seemed to apologize before they opened, he climbed a ridge and looked out over miles of green laid tenderly over old scars. Ghost nosed his hand and sat. The wind came across from the ocean smelling of salt and wet stone. The wall lay behind him and always would, a fact like the beat of his heart. He understood that he had been a bridge for a while, and bridges are built to be used, not worshipped. He thought of all those who had walked him. A girl with a needle-slim blade, a brother with storm in his veins, a sister crowned not by a man's permission but by the north itself, a queen whose fire had turned on her, a mother whose name he learned too late, a father who had been father enough. He bowed his head, and not to a god or a throne. He bowed to the lives that had touched his. The day he found a sapling sprouting from a crack in a stone and decided to move the stone instead of the sapling. Everything he knew about power and kindness arranged itself into something simple. He shifted the rock with careful leverage until the stem stood straighter, and after he had watered it with melted snow, he sat with his back to a tree and closed his eyes. The sun warmed his eyelids. He felt, for perhaps the first time, that the world did not require him to be more than a man among men. He had not escaped fate. He had carried it and set it down where it could do the least harm. At night, when firewood popped and the tents breathed in and out, he told stories to children who wanted to know how the world had survived a winter that was not only a season. He spoke without flourishes, as a man who has learned that ornaments weigh a tail down. He talked about how the living hold on to each other because there is nothing else as strong, about how walls keep some things out and some things in, and how every choice you make is a brick you will have to live beside. He told them that sometimes the right thing feels like betrayal and sometimes it is, and still the world needs it. He did not speak of miracles. He spoke of small decisions made in bad weather and of how love, when it is quiet, lasts longer than fear. When he could not sleep and the moon was a shard cutting the clouds, he would walk beyond the furthest tent and stand where the forest thickens. He would listen, first to the old noise of his own worries, then to the deeper quiet behind it. The night birds hunted and the fox slid through brush by instinct and the cedars creaked. He would breathe, and each exhale wrote itself into the cold air and disappeared, the way a man's name will one day leave the mouths of those who knew him and be remembered differently by the trees. He was content with that. He had been called many things, but in the end he preferred to be called by his given name while handing someone a length of twine that would hold a roof against wind. He did not chase redemption because he had learned it cannot be chased. It grows where work is steady and the hand is open. When old comrades came north with news of the world, treaties hammered into shape, crowns traded like heirlooms at a market, ships nosing at distant shores, he listened and smiled and gave them stew. He kept one seat empty at his hearth because ghosts are dignified and will not sit where they are not invited. Sometimes a raven would flutter down with a message addressed to him by a title he no longer wore, and he would untie the cord and read and then feed the parchment to the flames. The bird would watch with curious eyes and then accept a scrap of fat as a fair exchange. As years dulled the sharp edges of grief into smooth stones he carried without thinking, he realized that the world had given him exactly what he had asked for when he spoke his very first vow, a chance to guard. Only now he guarded children's laughter and a community's trust, guarded the fragile balance between story and truth, guarded seedlings and the old men who had no sons left to split their kindling. He guarded, too, the memory of those who could not grow old, not as relics to make him sorrowful, but as guides who made his feet find the right path when trails were snowed under. In time the snow began to fall softly even when the air was warm, a trick of the north that made seasons overlap as if they had learned to share. He found he could sit for long hours and let the day carry itself forward without his hand on its back. Ghost dreamed with his paws twitching, chasing prey in a world of scent and muscle memory. Tormund snored and complained about his own snoring. Children grew into hunters and hunters into storytellers. The wall remained a bright scar across the memory of the land, and crows still flew along it learning patience from the wind. The dead stayed where they had been put, and the living kept the fire fed. If he ever tired of the quiet, the forest hid the remedy within itself. A path he had not walked yet, a hill he had not climbed, a view that reminded him that even the sky has to learn the land before it can claim it. He would pause at the crest and let the horizon gather him up. The world below held no thrones, no courts, no lines of succession. It held valleys where mist pooled like milk, and rivers that forgot they had once been ice, and groves where the moss thickened into a softness made for the soles of bare feet. He understood that he had come at last to a place where duty and desire were two words for the same action. To keep walking, to keep watch, to keep kind. And when the last storm of his life came, it was not cruel. It carried the smell of the sea and the promise of new leaves. He felt it pass through him as a bell sound passes through a church, leaving no mark but resonance. He lay on furs that remembered his weight and listened to people he had taught sing a song without words. He let his hands rest where ghosts' ribs rose and fell. He thought of the first snow he remembered and the last spring he had planted, and both were good. He thought of the promise that had brought him into the world and how promises can be burdens or gifts and, if carried long enough, become both. He thought of a wall of ice and a chair of swords, and of a garden where saplings laugh at such things. The wind moved in the branches and became a hush again, the same hush that began his life. In that hush, he recognized not an ending but the steady continuation of a duty that does not require a single name to persist. Somewhere far south, fires were banked against an ordinary night. Somewhere nearby, a child woke and found that the door did not bang because someone had mended the brace. Somewhere in a place where the ground remembers, wolves howled just to hear their voices roll across the hills, and one howl, deeper than the rest, answered not out of grief but accompaniment. The snow kept its counsel. The forest breathed. The north at last, and entirely, belonged not to kings nor to the dead, but to the living who knew how to listen. After the hush settled and the last of the fire's sighing turned to amber thread and ash, the world did what it always does when a great story rests its voice. It carried on breathing. In the forests that had taught him endurance, the snow did not pause to consider legacy. It thickened in the hollows, leaned against trunks, roofed the caves and the mouths of old badger dens. It remembered his steps as any patient land remembers a familiar tread, not with ceremony, but by the slight easing of its crust, the way ice yields to a known weight. Ghost learned the new pattern first, because creatures of the wild make no treaties with grief. They only live and keep living. He ranged at dusk between bark the color of old iron and sky the color of a blind polar sea, his breath lingering in clouds that peeled away and broke, his paws soft as the snow's own thought. Where a village had grown from poles and pelts in the shelter of a broken ridge, the people set smoke into the morning again. They hauled up nets from under ice, their shoulders bent in the ancient curve that turns labor into prayer. Children learned to make the slow fire that coaxes the fat from fish without spoiling it. They learned the spring of a bow, the patience of a snare, the way to meet salt as if it were a story you do not tell all at once. They spoke of him with the sober intimacy reserved for weather and kin. The oldest among them had the gift of simplifying a life without reducing it. The red-bearded giant with a laugh that shoved doors open and a tenderness he kept tucked in his larger jokes would lean on a length of driftwood polished to a staff, and when little hands pressed him for tales, he would begin the way snowfall begins. Not with a shout, but with one soft flake that suggests the rest. He did not embroider his friend. He spoke of a lad who took the world's hardness as a whetstone and learned to cut his bread straight without cutting himself. He spoke of nights when a spark found in the most stubborn kindling can feel like the invention of mercy. He spoke of a field where men shoved death back with their shoulders because their hands were full, and of a hall reclaimed not by conquest but by a remembering so fierce it looked like bravery. He spoke of a young woman from the hills whose laugh had outlived her, because certain sounds do. He let the children take from these stories only what their day needed. The tales were not instruction. They were warmth, and warmth knows how to teach without telling. Ghost lay at the edge of such circles, eyes half-lidded, ears tuned not to the words but to the space between them. When winds cut down from the white ridges, he lifted his head and scented for a danger that would never again wear the face of winter itself. He aged in a way that did not ask pity. His muzzle salted, his muscles braided with wisdom that needs less speed. He learned where the ptarmigan brood, when the foxes birth, how far the aurora reaches when it decides to drape the world and make it quiet even where it is already quiet. Sometimes, when the tents breathed softly and the fires withdrew into coals, he would rise and prowl in a great slow circle around the sleeping village, his feet imprinting a loop that the children traced at dawn and judged by feel. A necklace of safety given each night, clasped anew at day. To the south, where towers of gray stone held the heat of hearths deep in their bellies and let it loose in corridors long after midnight, rule became a rhythm instead of a spectacle. The Queen of the Snows walked those corridors with the measured step of someone who accepts the length of a task before she begins it. She tightened old hinges the way she tightened old laws, not to make them harsher but to make them true. She amended punishments that had been written for an age of hunger and men who had lost their minds from it. She wrote in magnanimity where pride had once scribbled its name. She added a fifth granary. She sent riders before the first swallows to check the mountain passes that washed out every third spring and reminded masons to carve spillways into the new bridges so the river could be what it is, a traveler. When the weavers brought her a bolt dyed with lichen and madder that caught and held the undercolor of a March sunset, she ran her fingers over it with the seriousness she reserved for petitions. She understood the soul's appetite for beauty and the stomach's for bread were kin, and she refused to feed one at the other's expense. When she spoke in the great hall, it was not to command applause, and the hall, relieved of the duty to flatter, learned to listen like a field listens for rain. On nights when old songs were allowed, she stepped back and let the music remember all the names she could not. In the gods wood she stood sometimes without praying, because silence can be prayer enough. She traced the cracks in the weirwood's face with her gaze and thought, not as a queen, but as a daughter whose house had outlasted its architects and its enemies the way trees outlast the names carved in them. Birds carried letters through weather that would have frightened men. Ink froze and then thawed and argued with parchment. A hand in King's Landing, careful even in haste, wrote of ships docking with things the city had not tasted in a generation, of small lanes reclaimed from filth, of laws that learned grace as they aged. The king's signature looked like a tiding from a river whose bed had been scoured and now ran clear between banks that were still remembering how to be strong. Sometimes a small note was tucked at the end, a line about a rookery repaired or a crippled boy who had been fitted with iron braces and now chased dogs on two brave feet. In those lines, the queen thought she heard her brother as clearly as if he had been leaning at her window grinning, asking whether it was not a miracle that ordinary days, properly assembled, could hold up a kingdom. At the citadel, where knowledge is stacked higher than pride and the dust has opinions, a man with the patience of kindness and the cheer of someone who expects small good news wrote and rewrote a chapter that refused to be satisfied. He smoothed his pages with a palm that had once trembled on a blade's hilt and now trembled only when his milk skinned over if he took too long with a sentence. He argued, respectfully, with the dead writers whose words had informed him and whose ghosts he suspected remained in the margins shaking their heads or laughing. He had a family now. Love had not ruined his scholarship but given it a center, and he read to a child in the evenings, his voice the same whether he was speaking of dragons or of verbs. When he wrote of the North, he did not pretend to understand it entirely. He laid down what his heart knew, which is that snow is not white and that courage is often a matter of holding still. Across the sunsets west of Maps, a ship learned new names for wind. The girl who had been a shadow and a blade stood in the bow watching water behave like thought, running everywhere it could until it discovered where it belonged that day. Islands lifted themselves out of fog with the humility of seals. She shared bread with strangers whose knives told their own histories and whose songs made sense of currents. There were nights when the sea was a slab of hammered iron and days when it was a pane of glass that did not know how to break. She charted by stars and by intuition refined into craft. Sometimes she spoke aloud to a memory of a brother who had made a habit of stepping into danger as if it were his own house and pulling other people out of it. She did not say his name, not because superstition forbade it, but because the sea did not ask for names. It asked for attention and rewarded it with mercy. There were stories told of a dragon shadow seen at dawn over a chain of reefs far south, a dark shape riding thermals that smelled of salt and possibility. Fishermen argued about the angle of its wings. A boy drew it with the chalk of ground shell, and he ground the shell again and thickened the line until it was an animal and a mountain both. A girl swore she saw it place something gently on a lonely shore before it soared away, and when asked what she meant by gently, she said only that the sun glinted on the nearest wave the way a mother's eye will glint when she is thinking entirely about someone else. News like that traveled as news does when it is unprovable and beloved. It grew beautiful and it grew quiet. At the wall where ice had cracked and been reforged by more than weather, the men in black learned to wear their vows like comfortable clothes. There was less pomp now and more practice. They mended the stones that could be mended and let the others become what they had always wanted to be. Sitting places where men with sore backs consider whether the smoke means incoming travelers or a kitchen whose cook has been overgenerous with kindling. They taught maps to boys who had never seen a city and taught cooking to boys who had never believed a meal could be anything other than quick. They opened their stores without fuss when a blizzard laid its flat hand over the world. They began to think of the watch as a school for being useful. They became the sort of institution that needs no anthem because everything it does already rhymes. When free folk came south to trade, furs for iron, advice about snow for advice about stone. The meetings looked, after a while, less like tense rehearsals for betrayal and more like marriages practiced by entire communities. People learned each other the way valleys learn the rivers that cut them. Slowly, with occasional floods that rearranged the banks, with droughts that taught endurance, with ponds left behind for the delight of children who throw stones and judge the size of their lives by the splash. Arguments did not stop. They learned, however, to end. A dispute about a stray herd was adjusted by laughter and the careful blessing of an older woman whose hands smelled forever of wood smoke and salt. A dispute about words, what to call this beast, that weather, was settled by learning both and letting the air decide which felt right each day it was needed. The land to the true north, the land that keeps its own calendar, filled itself at its own pace. Winter broke hesitantly, as if convinced by speech rather than commanded by tilt. The light changed not by becoming brighter but by learning new shades of gray between the old ones, the way sorrow lightens by collecting company. Meltwater scribed cursive down old channels and occasionally invented a letter of its own. The ground smelled of iron and old leaves, a dark, decent perfume that promised patience will always have something to do. Caribou learned the old paths again and taught them to their calves with a prodding nose and a grunt that sounded like a throat reconsidering a vow. Owls practiced their ghostly flight until they decided the new silence was good enough to hold. When the first wild roses opened, mean little flowers with hearts tougher than a smith's apron, a child with hair like the inside of a chestnut sat on a rock with her legs kicking and watched a white wolf watch her. She did not reach for him because some wisdom does not need to be taught or smacked into a hand. She had heard enough stories to know this was not a dog. She also knew because justice teaches all manner of lessons while pretending it is only enforcing fairness, that being still can be a kind of greeting. After a time, the wolf yawned the way mountains yawn when they let a river find its wider voice, and he circled twice and lay down in sunlight that smelled of pine sap and insect songs. The child leaned back on her hands and listened to the day put itself together. A little later there was an evening when the sky forgot how to end and kept on being orange long after the fires were lit. Into that endlessness walked a woman from the southern cities whose feet were not built for snow but had learned it anyway. She wore traveling clothes that remembered better places but had not turned snooty about it. She visited because she had spent a year using her voice in rooms where rules are made and had felt the tug of quieter counsel like a hand at her sleeve. She had known a man who discovered his strength when there was no alternative, and she wanted to stand where he had stood and see if the air knew anything more than she did. She spoke with the free folk as easily as with the men of the watch, because politics when stripped of performance is only people asking and answering about food and safety and time. She left a small carved wolf at the base of the wall, not as an offering but as a bookmark. Letters crossed the kingdoms with their own stubbornness. Some were lists, salt, leather, a brass kettle with a lid that fits this time. Some were descriptions, an orchard finally bearing after 5 slow years, a stable that did not leak anymore, a road that no longer trapped a cart in spring, and a farmer's smile when he took twice the grain to market. Some were apologies, written by those who had discovered that the future they believed in required more kindness than power. Some were thanks, written by those who had once been asked to carry too much and had found that the share had been adjusted by hands skilled at fairness. All of them, the petty and the profound, formed a weave strong enough to sleep under. In Winterfell, the pipes that run beneath the stones and bring comfort like secrets kept their ancient promise. Women warmed their palms against smooth walls, and men slept without a worry for frost, and babies kicked awake when their mothers stepped near certain corners. The great kitchen thrummed with those quiet wars that make a dinner worth winning. The argument between the onion and the butter, the fierce insistence of a potato that it is not plain but honest, the compromise that a stew arrives at when it remembers that all its ingredients are immigrants. In the armory, a boy learned to oil a blade so that not a drop was wasted and not a speck of rust would find a purchase. In the buttery, an old man measured out cider with the gravity of a judge because he had learned that to pour is to decide. Season dragged its hems along the ground and then picked them up and ran for a while. The wolves littered and the pups learned their first lessons from puddles. A handful of saplings that had been stubborn in the face of wind learned to bend, and that trick kept them alive. A cliff sloughed off a portion of itself with a moan and became a new cliff no less itself than the old. People were born and people died, and neither event surprised the earth, which has been practicing both for a very long time. When there were funerals, the stories told at them were not insurance policies but lanterns. When there were weddings, the laughter contained a good amount of weather report because even love needs to know whether the roof will hold. On a night when the aurora braided itself over the whole sky like a story that refuses to be interrupted, Tormund sat on a stump and told a quieter tale than usual. He spoke of a man not as a leader or a lover or a killer or a saint, but as a way the world sometimes arranges a human being when it wants a certain work done. He said the North had not been tamed. To tame a thing is to make it forget itself, and the North remembered. It had been spoken to in its proper tongue. Respect, which is attention, and endurance, which is love that has learned to hold its breath. When he finished, he tapped his cup against the ground and said his friend's name only once, softly, because names are Ot pets, they are perfumes. We use them sparingly lest we stop smelling them. In dreams and in the green seeing of trees, there were glimpses. The king with eyes like deep water sat sometimes in a room that had been rebuilt from a room that history had already burned and rebuilt, and when his attendants left him to the business that cannot be delegated, looking, he let his mind travel the older ways. It wandered along routes and out into the world where everything living uses the same kind of patience. He saw a white wolf under a sky so pressed with stars that it seemed a basket might be needed to catch them if they fell. He saw snow burn pink with morning, and he thought of a brother. He did not try to change what he saw because power turned to wisdom when it accepts the difference between memory and map. He kept watching, as was his office. What became of the chair made of other men's ambitions cooled into a question people seldom asked anymore. Children heard about it as they hear about extinct animals, things that were fierce and fascinating and did not understand the price they paid for their own existence. They were shown blades as sharp as the old ones, but the blades were used in kitchens and in surgery and in shearing sheep and in carving new toys for small hands. It turned out that the test of steel is not whether it can scare a man, but whether it can be trusted not to break in doing ordinary work. The North, for all its old taste for glory, tolerated this common sense as welcome as thick socks in deep winter. When the first snow of a new cycle fell and stuck around instead of lying about it for an afternoon, a procession left Winterfell for the wall. Not of nobles only, and not a parade, just a line of folk with business and purpose and one bundle of wooden markers, each cut with a symbol and a name where a name was known. They set those markers into the old ground near the base of the great gate. No speeches belong to harvests and coronations. Instead, hands pressed to wood or to one another, and then small tasks were done because grief taught them to fix what is fixable. A rope rebraided, a hinge oiled, a nail driven in straight, a tear mended in a cloak with stitches neat enough to make a seamstress nod. Ghost nosed each marker and sneezed once and sneezed again, not as a ritual but as the honest result of 1,000 smells in air that was more alive than many cities. Past the markers lay a stretch of land so old it remembered when the moon was an untried ornament. Into that, the free folk and the companions whose patience matched theirs carried their shelters and their tools and their children and their jokes. They moved camp as weather advises the wise to move, and they considered the Northern Lights not as a miracle but as a reliable friend who shows off only when it suits both of you. They spoke sometimes at night about the days when the dead did not keep a civil distance, and they spared their children nightmares not by pretending but by explaining. The dead wanted what the living want, company, and had to be told no. In telling, the living reminded themselves they were permitted to refuse certain invitations. When news from far seas arrived, thick leaves stamped with seals whose designs told of newly agreed compacts, of islands nobody had wanted learning how to want themselves. The Queen of the North would sometimes take those letters to the godswood and read them aloud to nobody in particular. The white face in the red leaves did not react. Trees are not gossips. But in hearing her own voice lay out the comings and goings of worlds that had once threatened to spill over her walls like a wave over a child's sand fort, she felt the scale of the day adjust itself. She would fold the letters, thread them back into their chords, and make the slight smile we wear when we accept that something need not be perfect to be finished. Samuel, the scholar with kitchens in his heart and libraries in his hands, sent a crate north one year. It arrived smelling of beeswax and hope. Inside were small books bound in pale leather, meant not for nobles but for anyone whose eyes could get along with a line of words. Recipes that traveled well. Oatcakes that turned sternness to comfort with the help of a little butter. Cabbage, resurrected with vinegar and love. Remedies that did not promise miracles but could send a fever to sulk elsewhere. Histories written with the discipline of compassion, where the truth is told and the wound acknowledged without being asked to bleed again for the reader's pleasure. On the flyleaf of each book a note had been written, for quiet hours after hard days. These were shelved not centrally but broadly. A shepherd had one, a tanner, a widow who ran a small school in a loft that had learned to be warm. On the far shore of a sea that had once tried to climb into the sky on the back of a storm, a ship beached and men and women wore expressions that suggested they had decided to forgive their decision to come. They found trees the color of wet bronze and stones that sang when rain hit them. They drew maps that were wrong and corrected them and made the next ones wrong in new ways, which is the method of honest exploration. If the girl who had become a captain stood sometimes on the stern and watched the wake for the shape of a memory of a wolf or a boy, she spoke only to the wind about it, and the wind, which keeps secrets because it forgets them, carried her words west where they thinned into silence and then into weather. Ghost's steps grew fewer per day in deep winter, though his eyes did not. He learned to sleep in the cushions of sun pooled on stone, and on the coldest mornings he accepted a blanket from a hand he trusted because dignity knows when to delegate. Children who had grown into hunters and smiths still reached to touch his fur before setting out. Not for luck, but for the statistic that contact with something excellent improves a day. When he reamed, it was of running not toward anything but across it, the pure joy of distance being consumed by readiness. Time removed the pain from some names and polished others until they shone so gently you had to shade your eyes to see them properly. It is like this with memory. It becomes furniture in a house you are not moving out of. It was not that the world forgot the cold that does not bargain. It is that the world made itself busy. A woman invented a loom that did not waste so much yarn. A boy invented a sled that took corners like a fish takes a curve. The men of the watch invited a troop of tinkers to overwinter in their south lofts and found that laughter fills a keep as efficiently as peat smoke. A midwife discovered her hands were steadier if she hummed, and the babies of 3 winters learned to listen for that hum before they arrived and took comfort from it when they met the air. Seeds were saved. Tools were repaired instead of replaced. People began to criticize roofs as if roofs were friends who could try harder, and roofs, flattered, did. From time to time someone from the lowlands who had the means and the itch to go looking would travel north not for conquest but curiosity. They expected to feel small before the wall and did. They expected to be chilled and were. They did not always expect to be relieved. There is a particular relief that comes from being in a place that does not care about your arrival, because then you can set down whatever self you carried like a sword for rooms that required it. They came to the wall and saw not a monument to fear but a witness old enough to have learned humility. They watched the gate open the way a book opens, carefully, with attention to hinges that have already earned their keep, and they went through not to conquer but to be instructed by distance. Stories about him continued, not multiplied. This was good. Multiplication would have cheapened him. Instead, the stories deepened. A trapper told how the man who was once a boy in black could make a fire in a wind other men called impossible. A cook told how he always ate the heel of the loaf so someone else could have the center. A widow said that he faced down an argument like a dog faces down a boar, with a steady stare and the knowledge that charge is sometimes the stupidest tactic. No one pretended he had not failed. They named the failures without relish. The naming might have hurt once, Now it felt like the way you run a finger along a scar in the bath and think, yes, I remember that, and look at me, still here. One summer was fatter than fat and gave peaches to villages that had forgotten the word. The next ironed all the sweetness back out of the land and cracked a dozen wells. Men muttered about gods. Women set teams to digging, and the new wells brought up water that tasted like stone wisdom and solved none of the world's mysteries, but trimmed its emergencies. The winter after that was not cruel but thorough, and people learned to salt their laughter like their fish so it would last. A trader who had once sold cloth in a southern market bawled a northern lullaby to his yoke of oxen because he had discovered melody is not bound to a region. He swore the beasts pulled straighter. Others tried it and swore the same. It is hard to know what truth is in such matters. That is not an argument against the trying. When ghosts of men with human names visit, it is usually at night and usually at the edge of sleep. The dead are polite. They do not insist. If he came to anyone, he did so without requesting certainty. A woman knitting by a low lamp would look up and feel she had company. A farmer leaning in the doorway of his barn to taste the weather would nod as if to an old friend and go on nodding until the appropriate amount of respect had been paid to whatever is larger than barns and weather. A child who had never met him would wake and say he dreamed of a man whose eyes held a storm and a shore. The parents would exchange a look and let it be. The living must have their portion of the unknowable. They cannot always write it down and put it neatly on a shelf. There are always those who cannot let a story end. In an upper room of a tavern on a trade road used by sleds in one part of the year and by wheels in a more forgiving part, men sometimes argued themselves hoarse about whether he was a king and whether that mattered. The landlord, who had learned patience by stirring stew when patrons claim hunger means they cannot wait, and then they wait because stew is not improved by anger, would lean on a beam and listen with one eyebrow resigned. In the end, someone would produce a song that has fewer words than a good argument but holds its shape better, and the tavern would become quiet, as if the song had put a hand on each man's chest where he keeps his loudness. The landlord would ladle out another pot and let the steam argue in finer terms. And the years, which do not concern themselves with fans or detractors, put themselves away the way careful women fold good linen. Ghost slept more. He loved the parts of day that smell of sun on fur and old bone. He found vantage points and kept them. The white of him grew dingy and then respectable again when the snows renewed the world's brightness. On an evening when smoke hung low and blue and a thin crescent made a kind of promise behind the trees, he slipped away the way a proper north wind slips, without comment and in exactly the direction you knew it would go if you had been paying attention. People who owed him their safety felt their chests hollow and then fill, hollow and then fill, as the body does when it is surprised but does not intend to panic. Tormund sat a long while on his stump and said nothing, which for him was speech enough. In the morning there were tracks. They were not followed. You do not follow the last steps of a creature who has taught you anything. You honor them by making your own. Sometimes now the North tells other stories, not to replace the old one, but to add rooms to the house where that one sleeps. There is a tale of a midwinter caravan bringing south a pelt so white even the snow forgot to sneer at it, and a child of the river countries slipping her hand beneath to feel the softness and discovering her hand is her own again after a year of sickness. There is the story of a hunter who put down his spear because the herd came to water thinner than honor allowed, and how the herd fattened and forgave without speeches. There is a pretty lie about a weirwood the size of a castle gate that blooms in the dead of winter with flowers that do not wither until the thaw, that one is told to cheer travelers who have overestimated their boots. Pretty lies, if they are kind and confessed, are the salt you put on a meal that is already good. When the queen at last loosened her crown's imaginary weight and leaned back in a high chair by a window, she did so like a woman who understands that sitting is not surrender. The window showed her a courtyard where trainers were not breaking horses but introducing them to agreements. She watched a girl bow to a stallion and the stallion lower his head, and an afternoon learned to be gentle to itself. She thought then, not of battles or of banners burned or of the thousand demands that had once set up camp in her skull, but of a boy who used to glance at her from across a table as if asking permission to be her kin. She smiled in a way that did not ask for witnesses. Elsewhere, where the city's old black stones hold sunlight in their pores like good sponges, The king rose from his chair and walked into a garden rebuilt from the old angles of a different garden. He put his hand on the trunk of a tree that had not been there when he was a boy, and it recognized him, which is the best we can hope for from anything that grows. He closed his eyes, not to hide, but to see what the inside of the day looked like with the lids turned down. It looked like winter and then like spring. It looked like a friend. And out beyond, where the map becomes unreasonable and the sea learns new manners and then forgets them, a ship's wake braided and unbraided itself. The captain stood a while in the doorway to her own cabin, watching the work she had chosen continue without her hand on it every second, which is a flattering and frightening realization. She thought of home as a pressure, not a point, as gravity in the ribs rather than a roof in sight. She remembered a courtyard of stone where a boy practiced a dance with a sword that was mostly a lesson in listening, to feet, to breath, to the small voice that tells timing what it must be if it wants to wear the name timing. She nodded to that memory and then to the sea and went to sleep as a sailor sleeps, with one ear that belongs to the ship and one that belongs to herself. It is not a betrayal of great stories to say that after they end, other stories are needed. In the north, the need is satisfied daily. A man lifts a beam into place and does not throw his back because another man sets his shoulder in time. A woman picks ice from a river and judges a safe crossing by the way it splits. She adds her knowledge to a ledger kept not in ink but in a child's mind. The child learns both the tone and the intent and will pass it on because love attends to details. Fires burn that look no different than any other fire. People put their palms toward them and tell one another truths that fit into the mouth without tearing it. No one asks the flames for permission to live. They take it and give it back, and the exchange looks like flicker and smoke. On a hill north of the wall where the wind is an ant who tells you the same story until you realize she is telling you your own, there is a cairn of stones not important enough to have a name and important enough to remember. Those who pass there sometimes add a rock. Sometimes they straighten a fallen one. Sometimes they sit and watch the way the land lies down into itself. If you are unlucky, you will hear nothing. If you are lucky, you will hear the ordinary sounds of survival, and what luck to call those ordinary. If you are most lucky, you will hear a low note under all the rest, so steady you might mistake it for silence until you keep still and recognize in it the wordless thing that kept a boy walking long after boyhood had been spent and taught a man to lay down every name he had been given until only the useful one remained. That name, spoken now not as an alarm or a rally cry but as a benediction, travels the length of the world and returns. If no one answers it, that is not loneliness. It is peace. The wolves sing sometimes, not with grief but with appetite, hunger for distance, for the shape of their own throats learning the night again. Their voices friction the stars brighter. The snow changes its mind about a cornice and falls in a soft collapse that startles a rabbit into a better hiding place. A woman sets bread on a sill to cool, and a boy steals a heel and is forgiven because theft of that kind is a compliment. In a keep of carved stone, in a tent of stitched skins, in a low house half buried to fool the wind, in a boat racing the horizon, people close their eyes and see the same thing. A road under winter sky, a figure walking it without hurrying, the knowledge that he will do what is necessary before the day's light gives over to the long audience of stars. This is the sequel the world chose. Not a second throne, not a second storm, not a second bleeding of a wound already earned. It chose continuity. It chose to keep the gate oiled and the hearthstones clean and the kettle hanging steady over coals that know their business. It chose to tell the truth about a man and then to stop talking about him so that other lives could speak. It chose to honor with competence, to celebrate with moderation, to grieve with skill. In such choosing, the world showed that it had learned the tea. Hing he tried to teach without hectoring, that love is not the blaze but the banked heat, that duty is not grand but persistent, that mercy is not weak but accurate. And accuracy in that latitude and in that age was the difference between a winter that took and a winter that carried. In the end, as in the beginning, the wind does the stitching. It hems the edges of fields and tucks snow into outcrops, and threads whisper through ribs of trees until the forest sounds like a giant sleeping animal whose dreams are generous. The wall keeps standing where it can and does not where it cannot, and both are honest. The cities shed their old skins and the countryside grows new ones, and neither run out of snakes or wool. Rivers write their patient letters to the sea and receive in reply the long-winded comfort of waves. In 100 winters' time, a child not yet born will ask about him, and someone will answer without drama, the way you describe a trail that almost everybody knows now. He came from the cold and went into the cold and left warm places everywhere he stood long enough to be recognized. If that child wants more, the someone will point to the world and say, "Look and listen." And if anything else must be said, it will be said like this: there was a promise at the start and it was kept. The keeping made other promises possible. The land knows, the trees know, the wolves know, the people know. The snow, which is usually too busy being itself to remember anything, looks sometimes very nearly like it does too. When it falls, it makes the same patient sound it made the day he first lifted his face to it. The sound 1,000 fires imitate in the hour before sleep takes even the kindest watchers and gives the night back to itself. With one figure walking under it, steady and spare, a white shadow at his knee, the hush that made him and remade him, keeping him company, unafraid and unneeding of anything but the long road and the long sky and the long, unbroken breath of the world.